I call Paul Foster-Bell.
Sir, I'm speaking against this Environment Canterbury Democracy Restoration Amendment Bill. And unlike the previous member inferred, it's not because I have any problem with democracy. In fact, sir, I'm a great supporter of democratic institutions and methods of appointing governance bodies. Sir, the current arrangements which are in place for Environment Canterbury do not represent an abrogation of democracy. Need I remind the House that just 2 months ago, we actually had elections for Environment Canterbury, and would members opposite claim that a district health board, for instance, is an abrogation of democracy? District health boards which were in fact put in place by the previous Labor government, and which use exactly the same method of determining their members of their governance body. That is a combination of those elected and those appointed. But the point I would make first, Mr. Speaker, before delving into any of the details, is that these issues have been quite well canvassed in recent select committee hearings, recent as in the last 12 months. In Christchurch, we heard from those who suffered from the failures of the previous Environment Canterbury body. So when we hear pleadings from the other side that there was no fault found by the Creech report in Environment Canterbury, we know these are not the case. These are not the lived experience of people who actually had to tolerate the incompetence and the inability to arrive at decisions by Environment Canterbury as it previously was formed. We heard passionate arguments from, for instance, the disability community in Christchurch, who very credibly claimed before the committee that the situation for disabled passengers, for instance, on public transport, for which Environment Canterbury does have responsibility within that region, has improved massively under the current arrangements. And they paid enormous credit to Dame Margaret Baisley and others, appointed members who they said had brought into place much better, much more respectful, much more accessible systems for those with disabilities who rely on public transport. This was a lamentable failure by the previous Environment Canterbury governance arrangements. They let down one of the most vulnerable sections of our community. So when members opposite claim that they were doing their job and doing it well, they should actually hang their heads in shame at that failure to look after some of the most vulnerable people in this country. Sir, the previous Environment Canterbury failed to deliver a plan for the use of water in the region. One of the most important and one of the most fundamental duties that they were given by the people of Canterbury was to freshwater management, and they failed again lamentably in that. So I make no apologies for the arrangements which have been put into place by this government to firstly bring in commissioners, and then the transitional arrangements which have only just been recently introduced, and which recently involved an election with a combination of appointed and elected councillors, which is working well for the people of Canterbury. Certainly that is the evidence we heard on the committee. As the chair of the Local Government and Environment Committee, Mr Scott Simpson, the very fine member for Coromandel, said during his contribution, this bill is redundant. It seeks to amend an act that is no longer in force. So, as he mentioned, there's this hastily drafted supplementary order paper which seeks to amend the unfortunately completely irrelevant and out of date member's bill that the member allowed to continue to go forward in the ballot. But in my view, we have just elected a local and a regional council in Christchurch. We have a process in place, and it's a very sensible and pragmatic process in place to see a transition to fully elected councils in that area in 2019. But we are doing that in a controlled and sensible way, not the the chop and cut approach that Ms. Woods, Dr. Woods, is suggesting in her frankly embarrassing and ill-advised members' bill, that for some reason she failed to withdraw from the ballot when in fact the legislation that it amends has been changed. This will slow progress and lead to instability in Canterbury. This is something which the people of Canterbury do not need, and for that reason, sir, this bill must not progress.